In the winter of 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing into mud, smoke, and exhaustion. German units retreated west under constant pressure from Soviet armor. Whole regiments vanished in days, swallowed by the red tide of tanks and artillery. Amid this chaos, one small German detachment, cut off from the main line, prepared to make a final stand. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster commanded barely 60 men, infantry survivors, a few engineers, two 75mm Paquet 40 guns, and several Panzerfausts. No tanks, no air cover, almost no hope. But Schuster was known for his strange ideas, plans that often seemed insane until they worked. His soldiers called him Der Spinner, the madman. They found themselves near a stretch of forest crossed by a narrow dirt road. Scouts reported a Soviet armored column moving toward them. 10 tanks, supported by trucks and infantry. To retreat meant death in the open. To attack meant suicide. So Schuster decided to do neither. He would make the enemy destroy itself. All through the night, his men worked silently. Trees were felled across the road to funnel the tanks into a single approach. Shallow ditches were dug and covered with branches. Camouflage nets hid the two anti-tank guns, set at sharp angles to fire into the sides of the vehicles once they entered the clearing. Empty oil drums were placed as decoys, while snow and mud were shaped to look like wrecked armor. Even the machine gun nests were buried under frozen logs, invisible until they fired. Schuster planned the ambush like geometry. The first tank would pass unharmed, the second and third would be destroyed simultaneously to trap the rest. The fourth would halt, blocking the column, and panic would follow. Timing was everything. If one gun fired early, the entire plan would collapse. At dawn, mist hung over the forest. The men lay in their foxholes, breath steaming in the cold air. The sound came first, a low, steady thunder rolling through the frozen ground. Then the shapes appeared between the trees. T-34 tanks, dark silhouettes moving in single file, their exhausts smoking white against the gray sky. Schuster watched through his binoculars. The lead tank rolled into the clearing, turret turning lazily. Behind it, 9 more followed, heavy and confident. They had no reason to fear. German resistance in this sector had been broken days earlier. The officer raised a flare pistol, waited until the 5th tank reached the center, and fired one green light into the air. In that instant, the forest came alive. The first 75mm round struck the 2nd tank broadside, splitting it open in flame. A second shot hit the rear vehicle, sealing the column. Panzerfausts fired from both flanks. Explosions shook the trees. Soviet gunners answered blindly, shells tearing through branches. But the Germans were invisible. Fire and smoke swallowed the road. Within moments, what had begun as a routine advance had turned into chaos. 10 Soviet tanks were trapped in a corridor of fire, and the madman who planned it watched in silence as his design unfolded exactly as he had imagined. The first seconds after the ambush felt unreal. The explosions rolled through the trees like thunder, breaking the calm of the morning. Flames reached toward the gray sky as 2 Soviet tanks burned fiercely, their ammunition cooking off inside the turrets. Smoke and dust covered the clearing. The forest, moments ago silent, now roared with chaos. Oberleutnant Schuster stayed behind his position, watching every movement through his binoculars. His men followed the plan precisely. They fired once, then moved a few meters to avoid counterfire. The Soviet column, trapped in the narrow road, could neither turn nor advance. The lead tank hesitated, its turret swinging left and right. The rest crashed to a halt, engines revving, treads grinding against one another. From both sides of the clearing, the German guns fired again. One shell tore through a T-34's hull, throwing the turret into the air. Another round struck a KVA heavy tank, punching straight through its side armor. The forest echoed with metal tearing apart. Soviet gunners answered blindly, their shells ripping through the trees, shattering trunks, throwing splinters like shrapnel. Schuster's voice stayed calm, carried through short bursts on the field radio. He ordered the PAK crews to hold fire until they saw clear side profiles. He knew every second mattered. Their ammunition was limited. Each shell had to count. The infantry with Panzerfaust waited in shallow pits, their faces blackened with soot, ready for any tank that broke formation. For a brief moment, it looked like the Soviets might recover. The commander of the lead tank tried to force his vehicle forward through the burning wrecks ahead. Its engine roared, pushing the ruined metal aside. Schuster saw his chance. He signaled to the left gun crew. The shot struck low beneath the turret. The explosion lifted the tank from the ground and dropped it sideways into the ditch. Its crew never climbed out. Now panic spread. The road became a wall of smoke and flame. Tanks reversed into one another, grinding to a halt. Infantry jumped from their trucks, trying to take cover behind the vehicles. But German machine guns opened from hidden nests. The sound of MG-42 bursts merged with the crack of rifles and the deafening roar of shells. Through it all, Schuster moved between positions, mud splashing around his boots, shouting orders over the noise. The forest burned in several places, flames feeding on spilled fuel. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of oil. His men reloaded steadily, hands blistered from the freezing metal of the gun breeches. They fought like machines, disciplined, efficient, determined. After 10 minutes of fighting, half the Soviet tanks were destroyed or immobilized. The survivors tried to turn their turrets toward the gun flashes, but the angles of the ambush gave them no clear target. Shells exploded against tree trunks. Branches rained down over the trenches. One German gun was hit directly and silenced, its crew torn apart. The others continued to fire. The remaining tanks began to withdraw, but the road behind them was blocked by burning wrecks. Engines screamed as drivers tried to maneuver in the mud. Schuster ordered his last shells fired into the middle of the column. One round struck a fuel truck, and the resulting blast shook the forest like an earthquake. Fire washed across the snow, turning the clearing into a furnace. When the smoke began to settle, Schuster raised his head from the trench. The sounds of engines were fading. The ambush had lasted less than 15 minutes. 10 tanks had entered the forest road. None were moving now. The ground was covered in smoke, fire, and shattered steel. The officer exhaled slowly, his breath mixing with the rising haze. Around him, his soldiers emerged from their cover, faces pale, uniforms torn, eyes wide with disbelief. They had done what no one thought possible. But Schuster knew this was only the beginning. More Soviet units would come. They always came. The forest, still burning, would have to become their fortress. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a strange stillness fell over the forest. Smoke drifted between the blackened trees and the air stank of oil, metal, and burned rubber. The snow had vanished under layers of soot and mud. The once white clearing was now a graveyard of twisted steel. 10 Soviet tanks lay silent, their hulls still glowing from the heat. The forest had swallowed them whole. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster stood at the edge of the wreckage, his uniform dark with grime and powder. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion. His hands trembled as he wiped soot from his face. Around him, his men moved quietly among the destroyed vehicles, checking for survivors or ammunition. They were alive, but barely. Of the 60 men who had begun the day, several were gone. The first Paquet crew had been obliterated by a direct hit, and 2 riflemen had vanished in the fire. The survivors worked fast. Ammunition was gathered, weapons cleaned, and the wounded pulled into makeshift shelters behind the line. Their boots sank into mud blackened by fuel. The once solid ground had turned to ash. Somewhere in the distance, a tank engine coughed, not from the living, but from the dying, its motor still trying to turn. Then silence again. Schuster climbed onto the side of a destroyed T-34. The vehicle's turret was blown open like a can, its edges jagged and red. Inside, the heat shimmered off molten metal. He studied the pattern of destruction with the eye of a technician, not a soldier. Each hit was exactly where it should have been. The geometry of his plan had worked perfectly, but his face remained hard. He knew victory here was a small crack in a collapsing wall. The Red Army's strength was endless. For every tank destroyed, 10 more rolled forward. This ambush would slow them, but not stop them. Yet in war, time was as valuable as ammunition. Every hour mattered. He ordered his men to drag branches and mud over the destroyed tanks. From the air, the wrecks would look like scorched terrain, unremarkable, unworthy of attention. If Soviet reconnaissance spotted the scene, artillery would follow, and they had no defenses left against that. The men obeyed silently. Their movements were mechanical now, stripped of emotion. They had faced death and survived by inches. Even their voices were hoarse from smoke. As they worked, the light began to fade. The forest dimmed to a dull gray. The temperature dropped again, freezing the mud into a crusted layer that cracked underfoot. As night approached, Schuster gathered what remained of his unit. They took stock: one Paquet gun still usable, a few rifles, and scattered Panzerfausts. Ammunition was running low, food almost gone. But morale held. A strange, cold pride ran through the survivors. They had proven something few men on the front ever could. Schuster sat by the remains of the first gun, now just a bent barrel and a crater. He unfolded his field map under the dim light of a lantern. The Soviet main force would advance again by morning. Their commanders would not ignore the disappearance of 10 tanks. He traced the lines of terrain around the forest: small ridges, marshland, and a second road to the west. If the Soviets returned, they would attack from both directions. He had to anticipate it. Sleep was impossible. The forest hissed softly where the last fires burned out, and the wind carried the faint scent of fuel. Somewhere above, the distant hum of aircraft echoed through the clouds. Soviet reconnaissance planes, searching for survivors. The men stayed low, their breath steaming in the cold air. For the first time in hours, Schuster looked at the faces of his soldiers, pale, hollow, and unshaken. They were not just infantry anymore. They were the remnants of a machine that refused to break. Each man knew there would be no relief, no reinforcements, no retreat. The officer closed his map and looked east, where faint light still glowed beyond the horizon. That was where the enemy waited, regrouping, repairing, and preparing to strike again. In the darkness, the forest whispered around him. It was not victory they had won that day, but a moment, a fleeting pause in an endless storm. And when dawn returned, the storm would follow. Dawn came gray and heavy with mist. The air was damp, cold enough to sting the lungs. Smoke still lingered above the clearing, curling slowly into the pale sky. The forest looked dead, stripped of its color, blackened by fire. Nothing moved except for crows circling the wrecks of tanks. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster stood beside the remaining Paquet 40, his coat stiff with frost, his eyes sunken from exhaustion. He had not slept. None of his men had. They had spent the night rebuilding defenses: shallow trenches, concealed pits, makeshift barriers of logs and wreckage. The ambush had destroyed 10 tanks, but it had also revealed their position. Sooner or later, the Soviets would return. At first light, the scouts reported what Schuster already knew in his gut. Far to the east, through the thin fog, came the sound of engines. Many of them. The Soviets were back, this time in force. He listened to the low rumble, deep and rhythmic, like thunder rolling through the ground. It grew louder with every minute. The men moved with quiet precision. Ammunition was stacked, rifles checked, machine guns tested. They had little left, just enough for one more fight. Some soldiers had bandaged hands and burned faces. Others shivered from fever and cold. But no one complained. They had chosen to stay. Schuster climbed a small ridge and raised his binoculars. Through the drifting fog, he saw them. Another armored column, larger than before. T-34s in front, followed by trucks and self-propelled guns. Soviet infantry walked alongside, rifles slung, confident, unaware of the destruction that had taken place here the day before. The enemy believed they were advancing through empty ground. The German officer studied the terrain. The earlier battle had transformed the area. Trees splintered, ground cratered, air still thick with smoke. It was no longer an ambush site. It was a trap built from ruins. He adjusted his plan in silence. This time, there would be no surprise. The Soviets knew the risk. They would come ready to crush whatever remained. The first Soviet shells landed short, bursting among the trees. The ground trembled. Branches snapped, mud splashed, snow turned black. The bombardment intensified quickly, a rolling barrage that tore through the forest in waves. The men lay flat in their trenches, hands pressed to their helmets, as explosions rained down. The earth shook with every hit. When the shelling stopped, there was a moment of eerie quiet. Then came the tanks. Through the thinning smoke, their shapes emerged, dark silhouettes advancing steadily. turrets turning from side to side. The Soviet infantry followed, shouting orders drowned by the engines. The burned clearing became their path once more. Schuster crouched behind the Pak-40, giving short commands. The gunner, pale and shaking, waited until the first tank passed the wreck of a KV-1. Schuster nodded. The gun fired. The shell struck low, shattering the tank's treads. It lurched sideways and stopped. The next shot hit the second vehicle square in the side, bursting in flame. Soviet machine guns answered immediately, bullets cutting through branches and bark. The gun crew ducked, reloaded, fired again. Infantry with Panzerfaust crawled through the mud toward the flanks. They waited until the nearest tank turned its turret, then fired into the exposed armor. The explosion sent debris flying. The forest filled again with smoke, flashes, and the roar of engines. This time the Soviets did not panic. They spread out, firing into every shadow. Artillery joined in from behind, shells screaming overhead. Trees shattered and fell, crushing trenches. One German squad was buried alive. The survivors dug free with bare hands, coughing through the smoke. Schuster moved between positions, shouting orders that no one could hear over the noise. His coat was torn, his boots soaked in mud and fuel. Yet his voice remained steady. Each order came like a hammer blow, direct, sharp, absolute. The Soviets pressed closer, their tanks forcing a path through wrecks and fire. The PAK gun fired its last round, hitting a T-34 at point-blank range. The shell penetrated and the tank exploded, but the shock wave flipped the gun onto its side, destroying it. The crew scattered as burning debris rained down. Now the battle dissolved into chaos. Germans and Soviets fought among the wrecks, the air filled with smoke and the hiss of burning fuel. The forest, already broken, became a furnace. Flames spread from vehicle to vehicle, consuming everything. By midday, the clearing was once again a sea of fire. The Soviets had paid dearly for every meter, but they kept advancing. Schuster gathered what men he could and pulled them back deeper into the woods. They had done it again. Delayed the enemy, destroyed more armor, survived where no one should. The battle ended in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the hiss of cooling metal. The ground was littered with fragments of armor and scorched trees. What had once been forest was now a black desert, where snow, earth, and steel had melted into one. Schuster's men moved among the wrecks like shadows, gathering weapons, dragging the wounded, and extinguishing small fires with handfuls of dirt. The air was thick with smoke, too heavy to breathe without coughing. They had stopped another Soviet column, but at a terrible cost. Fewer than 30 men were still standing. Every weapon was damaged or nearly empty. The PAK gun was destroyed. Their last radio battery had died during the bombardment. They were alone, surrounded by the remnants of 2 battles, deep in hostile territory. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster stood near the wreck of a T-34, its turret lying upside down a few meters away. His coat was torn, his gloves black with soot, his face drawn but calm. Around him, men worked without speaking. They knew the next assault would come soon. The Soviets never left a victory unclaimed. That afternoon, the survivors built a new defensive line farther back in the forest. They used the ruins as barricades, piling logs, metal, and frozen earth into low walls. Machine guns were repositioned to cover the narrow paths that cut through the trees. Panzerfausts were distributed among the infantry. Every soldier carried at least one. The men who could no longer fight helped dig trenches or prepare stretchers for the wounded. There was no time to rest. The temperature dropped as night approached. The smoke settled into the hollow ground, turning the air gray and sour. The smell of burned oil and bodies hung heavy. Schuster walked the line quietly, checking every position. His men looked up at him, eyes hollow but alert. He nodded to each one, no words, just the small gesture of a commander who shared their fate completely. When darkness came, the sounds of the Soviet army echoed again from the east. Trucks, tanks, voices, hundreds of them. The rumble of engines vibrated through the frozen soil. They were regrouping. Schuster knew that by dawn, the forest would once again become a battlefield. He marked the approach routes on his map and ordered the men to hold fire until the enemy was inside the tree line. The night was long and cold. The men took turns sleeping in short bursts, their rifles clutched across their chests. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared into the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. A soft wind blew through the trees, carrying the faint smell of smoke and snow. Every sound, snapping of a branch, the crunch of frozen leaves, felt like an approaching tank. Just before dawn, a scout returned breathless. Through the fog, he had seen the red stars of Soviet armor moving along the forest edge. 20 tanks, maybe more. Trucks followed behind, headlights dimmed, silhouettes of infantry walking beside them. They were advancing cautiously this time, knowing what waited ahead. Schuster looked toward the eastern horizon, where the first light began to cut through the fog. The silhouettes of the trees stood like black pillars against a gray sky. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet before violence. He turned back to his men, their faces lit faintly by the glow of a small lantern. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, armed with scavenged weapons cut off from their army. Yet not one of them asked to leave. The forest was their only world now, their fortress, their grave, and their victory. As the first Soviet artillery shells screamed overhead, the ground erupted once more in a storm of fire and dirt. The men threw themselves into the trenches as the barrage rolled forward, smashing through trees and shaking the earth. When it stopped, the forest went silent again, for only a heartbeat. Then came the roar of engines, closer this time, followed by the heavy rhythm of tracks grinding against frozen soil. The Soviets were coming. Schuster adjusted his binoculars, his breath misting in the cold. Through the drifting smoke, he saw them, black shapes moving steadily toward the trees. The third attack had begun. He whispered to himself, steadying his nerves, and raised his signal flare once more. The last ambush was ready. The Soviet tanks emerged from the fog like giants of iron, their hulls black with soot from the burning wrecks ahead. Snow and ash mixed beneath their treads, leaving deep scars in the earth. Behind them came infantry, spread wide, rifles raised, shouting orders drowned by the roar of engines. The Red Army was cautious now. They knew what had happened here before. They fired blindly into the forest, shredding branches, tearing the air with shrapnel. Schuster watched from a shallow trench, calm despite the chaos. His men waited in silence. Every rifle barrel and Panzerfaust was hidden beneath branches, every movement calculated. They had no artillery, no radio, no supply line, only their discipline and the terrain itself. The lead T-34 rolled slowly into the clearing, its turret scanning the dark forest. It stopped beside a burned-out KV tank, its machine gun firing short bursts into the smoke. Another tank followed, then another. Soon the road was full again, metal grinding on metal, engines rumbling like thunder. Schuster waited. The temptation to fire early was strong. The men could feel the vibration of the tanks through the frozen ground. But he gave no signal. Not yet. The Soviets had to believe the area was empty, abandoned by the retreating Germans. When the fifth tank reached the bend in the road, he raised his flare pistol and fired one red streak into the air. The forest erupted. Panzerfaust launched from both sides, streaking through the fog with a sharp hiss. Two explosions tore through the front of the column. Flames burst from the tanks, lighting the trees in orange and black. The infantry scattered in panic, some diving into the snow, others firing wildly into the shadows. Machine guns opened up from concealed nests, cutting down soldiers who tried to regroup. The forest echoed with the sound of gunfire and splintering wood. Smoke rolled thick and heavy, swallowing everything in sight. The air burned with the stench of fuel and powder. A tank at the rear tried to turn around, but the road was too narrow. It slid into a ditch, exposing its side. A Panzerfaust hit it dead center, and the explosion sent its turret spinning into the trees. The shockwave knocked men to the ground. The Soviets fired back with everything they had, shells tearing through the forest, exploding among the Germans' positions. One trench was obliterated in an instant, its defenders buried under dirt and snow. Schuster shouted over the noise, moving between the foxholes, his voice rough and steady. He directed what was left of his men, 10 on one flank, 12 on the other, to focus on the middle of the Soviet column. The goal was not to win, only to break their formation again, to buy more time. The fight raged for nearly 20 minutes. Tanks burned where they stood, their fuel spilling into the mud. Soviet infantry tried to flank the German line, but ran into hidden mines and booby traps laid the night before. The blasts echoed through the trees, turning the air into chaos. Schuster's trench shook as another shell landed close by. Dirt rained down, filling his collar and boots. He looked up just in time to see the last of his machine guns go silent, its barrel glowing red. Its crew lay still. The remaining Germans fought on, switching to rifles, grenades, anything that still worked. By late morning, the forest had become a furnace. Flames climbed from the wrecks, painting the smoke a deep red. The snow hissed and melted into black water. The temperature rose sharply from the heat, and the air shimmered above the burning metal. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar began to fade. The Soviets, unable to advance or see through the smoke, began to pull back. Their tanks reversed slowly, covering the retreating infantry with heavy fire. The ground shook under the last few shells. Then silence returned. When it was over, the forest was unrecognizable. The battlefield looked like the end of the world. Cratered earth, burning trees, the twisted remains of steel giants. Schuster's men emerged from the smoke one by one, coughing, limping, covered in soot. Fewer than 20 remained. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, their eyes dull, yet they were alive. They had faced the third attack, and once again, they had held. Schuster climbed onto the wreck of a destroyed tank and looked across the field. The Soviet advance had stopped. For the third time, the forest had swallowed an entire column. But as he watched the smoke drift eastward, he knew this could not last. The enemy would come again, with more tanks, more men, more fire. The forest could not protect them forever. Still, for now, they had done the impossible. And in the frozen silence that followed, every survivor knew that they had become part of something that would never be forgotten. When the last echo of battle faded, darkness returned to the forest. The smoke from burning tanks hung low among the trees, glowing faintly with embers that refused to die. The once white snow was gone, replaced by layers of mud, ash, and steel fragments. The air was thick, warm in places where fires still smoldered, freezing cold everywhere else. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster stood among the wrecks, his face streaked with soot, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. Around him, the survivors worked silently, dragging bodies from the open, gathering weapons and ammunition from the fallen. Every man moved as if in a dream. No one spoke. No one complained. They had survived 3 Soviet assaults in less than 2 days. They could hardly believe they were still breathing. By nightfall, the forest was quiet again. The distant rumble of engines had faded, replaced by the soft crackle of flames and the moan of wind through shattered branches. Schuster ordered the men to rest in shifts. They had no food left and only a few canteens of half-frozen water. Still, they refused to abandon their positions. They knew another attack would come with the dawn. The officer walked along what remained of their defensive line. The trenches were half filled with debris, the machine guns twisted from heat. Bodies of Soviet soldiers lay scattered in the dark, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. The smell of burned oil and cordite clung to everything. Even breathing felt like swallowing smoke. Schuster stopped beside the last working Panzerfaust team. 2 soldiers, barely older than boys, were cleaning the weapon under a piece of canvas. Their hands trembled from cold and exhaustion. He placed a hand on one man's shoulder, a gesture of silent approval, and moved on. He had no words left. By midnight, the wind shifted, blowing the smoke eastward. The stars appeared through the black canopy, faint and distant. The world seemed frozen in place. Schuster sat near the base of a tree, unwrapping his field map with stiff fingers. It was torn and stained, the edges burned. He studied it by the light of a flickering lantern. There was no hope of retreat. Every road west was already behind Soviet lines. The only option was to hold this ground until orders, or fate, decided otherwise. Somewhere in the darkness, a distant engine sputtered to life. The men froze, rifles raised. But it was only a damaged tank, its motor dying slowly. The sound faded, leaving only the whisper of wind. The soldiers exhaled and lowered their weapons. Schuster finally allowed himself a few minutes of rest. He sat on a fallen log, his back to the warmth of a burning wreck. His thoughts drifted to the beginning of the war, the endless victories, the parades, the belief that the Reich could never fall. All of that was gone now, swallowed by this forest, by the mud and the smoke. Only men remained, tired, cold, and unwilling to surrender. The night passed slowly. Occasionally flares rose over the eastern horizon, faint arcs of red light marking Soviet positions. The rumble of engines echoed far away, distant but moving closer. The men stirred, gripping their rifles tighter. Schuster looked at his watch. It was almost 4 in the morning. Dawn would come soon, and with it, another assault. He stood and walked back to the line. The survivors were awake, eyes red, faces expressionless. They knew what was coming. He checked every position once more. The remaining Panzerfaust were distributed among the men. A single MG-42 had been repaired enough to fire a few bursts. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. When he returned to his trench, Schuster looked east. The faintest light touched the horizon. Not sunlight yet, but the gray glow that came before it. The forest was still, holding its breath. Then, far off in the mist, came the sound again. Engines, many of them. The Red Army was regrouping. The fourth attack was forming. Schuster's expression didn't change. He simply adjusted his helmet, checked the safety on his pistol, and took his place among his men. They were not waiting for rescue anymore. They were waiting for history to remember them. The forest, black and broken, would soon burn again. The first light of morning crept through the shattered forest. The fog hung low, carrying the faint hum of engines. Every man in Schuster's unit was awake, waiting, motionless in the cold. Their uniforms were stiff with dirt and soot. Their eyes were dark and hollow, fixed on the tree line ahead. The forest was dead, stripped bare by fire, yet it still held its breath before the storm. Then came the sound, deep, steady, and relentless. The ground began to vibrate. From the eastern mist, the Soviet armor appeared once more. Dozens of dark shapes rolled forward in a wide formation, turrets turning from side to side. The air trembled with the weight of their movement. Behind them marched infantry, silhouettes stretching across the gray horizon. This time, there would be no surprise, no illusion. The enemy knew exactly where Schuster was. They were coming to crush what was left. The first shells landed before the tanks even reached the clearing. Explosions ripped through the forest, shaking what few trees still stood. Earth and shrapnel rained down on the German trenches. Schuster ducked as a blast tore through the ground nearby, filling the air with splinters and flame. The barrage went on for 10 minutes, turning the landscape into a storm of mud and fire. When it stopped, the tanks began to move again. The Red Army advanced in full strength, now T-34s, KVs, and IS-2 heavy tanks, supported by waves of infantry. The noise was deafening. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of burning oil. Schuster gave the order to hold fire until the first line entered the ruins of the clearing. His voice was hoarse but steady. His men obeyed without hesitation. They had done this before, and they would do it one last time. When the Soviet armor reached the burned wrecks of its fallen comrades, Schuster signaled. The first Panzerfaust streaked from the trees and slammed into a tank's side. The explosion sent smoke and metal flying. A second shot followed, then a third. Within seconds, the front of the Soviet formation erupted in flame. Machine guns opened from hidden positions, cutting into the advancing infantry. The forest echoed with the crack of rifles and the hollow thud of explosions. Schuster's men fought like ghosts, appearing and vanishing in the smoke. But the Soviets had learned. They did not stop. Their guns roared back, blasting through the forest with devastating precision. Entire sections of trees vanished in flashes of fire. The ground shook under each impact. German positions were wiped out one after another. Men who had survived 3 battles were now buried under mud and splinters. Schuster crawled through the shattered trenches, shouting orders. His boots slipped in the black water that covered the ground. One of his soldiers tried to fire a Panzerfaust, but the launcher jammed. He used a grenade instead, leaping forward before disappearing in the explosion. The air smelled of death and burning iron. For half an hour, the forest became a furnace. Every explosion lit the sky, red and orange. Soviet tanks pushed forward, firing into every shadow. The noise was constant engines, gunfire, the scream of shells. Schuster's ears rang until he could no longer tell where the sound came from. At last, the German resistance began to break. The left flank collapsed first, then the right. The Soviets poured into the ruins, crushing everything in their path. Schuster's last machine gun fired until its barrel glowed white, then jammed forever. The few surviving infantrymen fell back into the inner line of the forest, firing their last bullets before fading into the smoke. Schuster stood behind a fallen tree, pistol drawn. Around him, the forest was alive with fire. He could see tanks rolling past the burning wrecks, their silhouettes glowing in the orange light. He had nothing left. No shells, no guns, no men to command. Yet he refused to move. In one final act, he triggered the detonator connected to the buried fuel barrels and explosives his engineers had planted days earlier. A series of sharp blasts rippled through the clearing. Then came the roar, a wall of fire erupting across the forest floor. The explosion consumed everything, tanks, soldiers, and trees alike. The ground buckled under the force. When the flames subsided, the clearing was gone. Nothing but smoke and twisted metal remained. Schuster lay among the debris, his uniform scorched, his face blackened with ash. Around him, the few survivors stared in silence. The forest that had sheltered them was now a wasteland. But the Soviet attack had stopped once more. The fourth wave had burned to nothing. They had no ammunition left, no strength, no way out. Yet somehow, against all logic, they had endured again. As night fell, the wind carried the smell of smoke across the endless trees. The stars were hidden behind clouds. The men did not speak. There was nothing left to say. By dawn, the forest was no longer a place of trees and snow, but a wasteland of craters and fire. The ground smoked in dozens of places where fuel still burned. The air shimmered with heat despite the freezing wind. The snow had melted into a thick black sludge that clung to boots and uniforms. Every step left a print of ash. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster rose from the mud with stiff movements, his body numb from cold and exhaustion. His coat was torn, his face gray beneath layers of soot. Around him, the survivors, barely a dozen men, moved silently, collecting weapons from the dead. The last Panzerfausts were gone. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, yet none of them spoke of retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. The battlefield around them looked like a nightmare. Dozens of tanks lay wrecked and burned, their turrets torn off, their hulls split open. Some still hissed as frozen air met glowing metal. The trees stood as black stumps, twisted and cracked. Smoke drifted low across the ground, mixing with the morning fog. The silence was total, broken only by the occasional rumble of distant artillery far to the east. Schuster walked through the ruins with slow, deliberate steps. He passed the destroyed Paquet guns, the trenches filled with debris, the remnants of men who had fought beside him. Every detail etched itself into his memory. It was not victory he felt, only the heavy weight of survival. They had stopped the Soviets again, but at a cost that could never be repaid. He climbed the slope at the edge of the clearing and looked east. Beyond the smoke, faint movement stirred. Small figures, distant, cautious. Soviet scouts. The enemy was returning to inspect the carnage. Soon they would bring artillery to finish what the tanks could not. Schuster turned back toward his men. They stood quietly among the wrecks, waiting for his decision. He studied them one by one. Faces blackened, eyes hollow, hands trembling from fatigue. Soldiers reduced to shadows. Yet behind that exhaustion, he saw the same determination that had kept them alive for 3 days. The refusal to surrender, the instinct to fight even when all reason said it was over. He gave a short order. Prepare to withdraw. The men obeyed without question. They gathered their remaining rifles, medical kits, and canteens. They left the dead where they lay. There was no time for burial. The forest itself would bury them soon enough. The small group moved west, deeper into the smoke. The air was thick, hard to breathe, each step sinking into soft mud. They passed the wreckage of Soviet tanks, their steel carcasses still warm. Inside one, Schuster glimpsed the burned outlines of the crew, blackened figures frozen in their final moments. He turned away without slowing his pace. For hours they moved through the ruins of what had been their battlefield. The forest grew quieter the farther they went, until even the sound of distant guns faded. The men marched in silence, their boots crunching through frost and cinders. Above them, the sky was gray, streaked with smoke that stretched for miles. By midday, they reached a low ridge overlooking an open valley. Beyond it lay frozen fields and the faint line of another forest. Somewhere past that, the retreating German forces were regrouping. Between them and safety was open ground, and the risk of Soviet patrols. Schuster ordered a halt. The men collapsed into the snow, too tired to move. He scanned the valley through his binoculars. No movement, no sign of pursuit yet. The Soviets were still busy counting their losses. He allowed himself a moment of stillness. Below, the wind swept across the charred trees, carrying black ash into the sky. From this distance, the battlefield looked like the aftermath of an explosion that had erased the earth itself. And in a way, it had. A single forest turned into a grave for men and machines alike. Schuster lowered the binoculars. He knew the battle would soon be forgotten in the chaos of the collapsing front. No report would tell how one small unit had destroyed dozens of tanks, how they had held a position for 3 days against overwhelming force. History would simply note a delay in Soviet progress. But for the men who had fought there, it would remain forever. The fire, the smoke, the endless roar of engines in the mist. As dusk approached, snow began to fall again. The flakes melted as they touched the still warm ground, hissing softly in the silence. The men rose slowly and prepared to move. Schuster looked back once more toward the east. The smoke had thinned, revealing the broken skeletons of trees and tanks. The forest that had been their shield and their grave was now gone. He turned away and led his men westward into the falling snow. The footsteps of the last survivors of the ambush faded into the cold wind, leaving behind only silence. By the fourth morning, the snow had returned in full force. Thick flakes fell over the desolate landscape, covering the blackened ground in a thin white sheet. The forest where Schuster's men had fought was now only a shape in the distance, a gray scar beneath the horizon. The smoke had finally stopped rising. Nothing remained alive there. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schuster led the last of his men through the open fields west of the battlefield. The wind cut through their torn coats, carrying the smell of ash and burned oil even here, miles away. Each man walked in silence, rifles slung, boots heavy with frozen mud. They were no longer soldiers in formation, but survivors wandering through a world that no longer recognized them. The march was slow. Every few minutes, someone stumbled or fell. Frost clung to their faces and eyelashes. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had spent everything: strength, ammunition, emotion. Only instinct kept them moving. As they neared a line of frozen trees, Schuster stopped and turned to look back. The horizon glowed faintly orange where the fire still smoldered beneath the snow. It was hard to believe that place had once been full of life, that it had been a forest, a road, a world of men and machines. Now it was a monument of destruction. 10 tanks destroyed in the first day, dozens more in the days after. A single unit, armed with almost nothing, had halted an entire Soviet advance. For 3 days, one crazy plan had defied an army. Schuster lowered his gaze and continued walking. His boots crunched softly on the frozen ground. The cold stung his fingers through his torn gloves. Somewhere in the distance, artillery echoed, faint and rhythmic. The front was moving again. The war rolled westward, swallowing everything in its path. By midday, they found the remnants of a German convoy, burned-out trucks, shattered wheels, and empty ammunition crates scattered in the snow. The soldiers searched through the wrecks for food or fuel, finding almost nothing. One man uncovered a frozen loaf of bread. Another found a half-empty water canister. These were treasures now. They rested for an hour behind the wrecks, shielded from the wind. Some of the men slept sitting up, too weak to remove their helmets. Others simply stared at the ground, lost in thoughts that words could no longer reach. Schuster sat apart, leaning against a broken tire, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. He knew the war was lost. The Red Army would soon sweep through every forest, every road, every field until there was nothing left of the Reich's Eastern Front. But what they had done here, what his men had achieved, was something beyond defeat or victory. It was proof that courage and precision could still matter, even at the edge of destruction. As the sun dipped low behind the clouds, they resumed their march. Snow fell harder now, blurring the horizon, erasing their footprints almost as soon as they were made. The landscape became white and endless. Late that evening, they reached a small village, half ruined, abandoned. Doors hung from hinges, windows broken, roofs collapsed. They took shelter in the remains of a barn. The men lit a small fire using splintered beams, its orange glow flickering weakly against the frost-covered walls. For the first time in days, they were warm. Schuster sat near the fire, his face lit by the flame. He reached into his pocket and unfolded his battered field notebook. The pages were smeared with mud and blood, the ink nearly washed away. With a trembling hand, he wrote the last entry. Held position 3 days. Destroyed at least 30 enemy tanks. Unit reduced to 12 men. Supplies gone. Moving west. Mission complete. He closed the book carefully and placed it inside his coat. Then he leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the wind outside. That night, snow buried the last traces of the battle. The forest where it had all happened disappeared beneath a white silence. The Soviets would later find only wreckage, melted steel, burned trees, and a few scorched helmets. No one would know the full story of how a handful of men had turned one forest into a graveyard of tanks. For the world, it would remain a nameless skirmish, another lost record of a dying war. But for the survivors who marched into the snow that day, it was more than a fight. It was proof of human will, of discipline born from desperation, of the thin line between madness and genius. And somewhere in that endless winter, the legend of the mad officer who destroyed 10 tanks with one impossible plan began to spread, carried by whispers among soldiers retreating west, retold in bunkers and camps. It was said that when the forest burned, it burned with German fire, precise, relentless, and unbroken to the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.